Let's get started. Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar on the UK's green trade strategy. My name is Ingo Borchert. I'm a Deputy Director of the UK Trade Policy Observatory, which is a partnership between the University of Sussex and Chatham House. Now, currently with all these Brexit and supply chain issues, shortages of drivers and butchers and all the rest of it that sadly affect our daily lives, it's all too easy to forget that there's a big agenda out there about trade policy and environmental goals that is of strategic importance. And therefore, we are very pleased to host this webinar on a comprehensive green trade strategy for the UK, now that we are in the run-up to the COP26. Underpinning today's webinar is a paper written by George Riddell and Sam Lowe that explores these linkages between trade and environmental policies in great detail. And that document is available from the UKTPO's website. So we should get going as fast as possible. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Creon Butler, who will chair the webinar. Creon is a director of Chatham House's Global Economy and Finance program. And he's also the research director for trade and investment and new governance models. Prior to joining Chatham House, he had a senior role in the Cabinet Office where he advised, amongst many other briefs, on climate change as a global economic issue. So he brings an unrivaled experience and deep knowledge to that discussion. So I'd like to thank Creon and the speakers for making themselves available. And without further ado, over to you, Creon. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ingo, and thank you for inviting me to moderate this discussion, which, as you say, is both very important and also very timely. The past 18 months has seen an extraordinary change in the international policy community's awareness of and focus on climate change, as it has become increasingly clear that climate change is accelerating and the effects, if nothing is done or sufficient isn't done, will be substantially worse than was previously feared. Talk of climate emergency is no longer, by any sense, an exaggeration. And one can see the impact across the full range of international economic policies, from financial stability and the work of the Financial Stability Board, through monetary policy, the treatment of developing country debt, and also, increasingly, I think, overarching fiscal frameworks. But trade is center stage, partly because of its positive potential to accelerate action on climate change, through, for example, freeing up the trade in green goods, but also because it is perceived, by some at least, as a way to deal with different levels of commitment to climate action, and partly also because of its role as a potential shock absorber as we face increasingly important macroeconomic consequences from extreme weather events and perhaps increasingly extreme policy shifts as the climate emergency takes hold. There's also a factor which I think is less spoken about, at least by people on the sort of climate side of this, which is that we need to ensure that climate action does not lead to unnecessary economic costs. Essentially, we need to align climate action with trade theory as well as trade policy with climate action. Now, in this context, today's paper by George Riddell and Sam Lowe is incredibly useful, I think partly because it addresses all these broader questions of the role of that trade should play in climate action, but also because it looks specifically at what this means for the UK. And ahead of the UK chairing COP26 in a couple of weeks' time, this is clearly very important. I think the authors will be very well known to this audience. George Riddell is Director of Trade Strategy at EY London, where he is primarily responsible for advising companies on their international trade strategy. He has a decade of experience in international trade, and prior to joining EY, he spent 6 years representing the UK in the World Trade Organization. Sam Lowe is a senior research fellow at the Centre for European Reform, and a visiting senior research fellow at the Policy Institute, King's College London. He's also co-founder of the UK Trade Forum. He works on trade issues with a focus on Brexit, customs and regulatory barriers, and trade and services, and he was previously a member of the British government's Strategic Trade Advisory Group. George and Sam will present the paper over the next 25 minutes, and then we will have a discussant response from Emily Lydgate, and I'll introduce Emily properly at that time. And then we'll move to Q&A. Just to say at this point, we're very keen to get questions from the audience. Don't wait until we get to the Q&A session to start posting your questions, and please include them in the Q&A function on Zoom. Great. Finally, I should say this is going to be recorded. It's obviously on the record, so everyone should be aware of that. Okay, it's from me then over to George and Sam. If you could put your videos on, that's excellent. And George is going first.
Thanks, Creon, and thanks to the UK Trade Policy Observatory and Ingo and all the colleagues who commented on our paper and made it better and are hosting this session today. Really is appreciated. So just taking a step back as to why we wrote this paper, and I think it came out of a general sense of frustration that because green trade issues are extremely complicated, they're interrelated, there was no one place where sort of talking through what could the UK actually do in order to really align its climate and trade objectives. Back in sort of the summer, we saw the UK Board of Trade, which is an advisory body to the Department of International Trade, publish a paper on green trade. But that paper was very much an economic analysis around the benefits of increasing trade in environmental goods and services, but didn't really go into the meat of, okay, so how do we actually get there and do that? We've also seen a number of parliamentary inquiries, whether it's the International Trade Committee in the House of Commons or the APPG on trade and export promotion, both conducting evidence sessions at the moment around sort of the UK's trade and climate agenda. So what we've tried to do in this paper is bring together the different policy issues facing the UK and really how to align the UK's green trade agenda across the many different sort of policy tools that are available to be utilised. We split it broadly into 4 sections. The first going around sort of what can be done through international trade negotiations and forms of trade cooperations. The second is around unilateral actions. So what could the UK do domestically in order to boost its international trade in sort of environmental products and services? The third is around decarbonising international trade and greening supply chains. So really looking at it from the private sector view as well, and how do those two interact between government policy and companies actually looking to either green their supply chains or start producing more environmental products or services. And finally, the 4th section goes into sort of the government incentives and what can DIT in particular, but also the Foreign Office and other government departments really do in terms of promoting this green trade agenda, both for UK companies, but also around the world as well. We shamelessly have referenced all the available work that's been going on around the world on the many topics that exist and that we cover. We're not experts in all of them by far, but I think there really is value in bringing together the various issues as they go forward. And also where we've covered different topics, what we've tried to do is either provide recommendations on how the UK can provide a more aligned and comprehensive UK green trade strategy, or areas of future research where there would be benefit in conducting sort of additional thinking in order to iterate some of the issues that we cover. Sam and I are going to pick sort of 3 topics from the 27 or so issues that we cover. I think if we tried to list them all out here today, 1, it would be difficult to do that. 2, I think everyone would get a little bit bored of us speaking. So in the interest of sort of fostering discussion and sort of having a bit of back and forth with the questions and answers later, decided to limit ourselves to 3 topics each. If I go first then, so I think the first topic I'd like to cover is sort of environmental goods. And this is one where sort of there are a number of issues that currently are, coming to play, and sort of does a good job of linking that unilateral action that the government's taken to the international and multilateral as well. So lowering tariffs on environmental products is something that the UK has already done unilaterally through the UK global tariff. And this was sort of announced a couple of years ago as part of the process of leaving the European Union, and certainly was a good thing. And what the UK government used was at its base was, by and large, a list of different product classifications that had been developed as part of the environmental goods negotiations, which were taking place at the WTO. Interestingly, those negotiations failed back in 2016, but the UK took the step to unilaterally, by and large, with a couple of notable exceptions being bicycles and some electric vehicles, incorporated that as part of its domestic tariff schedule. One of the things that sort of is that linkage between the domestic and multilateral is that what the UK has done through the UK global tariff is quite a static list as of right now. And this is where one of the recommendations that we make is that because environmental technologies and products are developing at such a rate at the moment, that having a static list of environmental products actually risks crowding out newer forms of environmental products as they come onto the market. So it's not something that can be static, even if it is, a good measure that the UK has taken in its domestic environment. There's also things that the UK can do internationally as well around this initiative. Certainly there are ongoing discussions at the WTO as to how to restart those EGA negotiations. So certainly feeding in the UK experience of having actually implemented some of the original EGA list would be, I think, incredibly beneficial. There's also linkages to what happens at the World Customs Organization, because the question of how do you actually define what is an environmental good in terms of the tariff classification as those products are coming in and out of the UK is actually an incredibly important issue. It's one that, certainly trade nerds get, very excited about, because those tariff classifications can make a huge difference as to whether a product is coming in under sort of a preferential tariff, whether it's sort of unilaterally or as part of a trade agreement or not, and being charged, 5, 7, 10% of a customs duty at the border. So even though we start with this idea of lowering tariffs on environmental products is a good thing, there's, obviously a huge amount that goes into that decision. Which products do you choose? How do you expand that list out going forward, particularly for developing countries? That is a very important question, where sort of the types of environmental products being produced in other parts of the world aren't necessarily your solar panels, your wind turbines, but there's more around sort of sustainably produced commodities and other things like that. So just to give a bit of an illustration as to how complex some of these questions are, even if we start from the premise of lowering tariffs on environmental products is a good thing. Moving to sort of the other two issues that I picked. The second is around trade promotion. So the UK government, through the UK Export Finance, has done a really good job of divesting away from fossil fuel investments in terms of trade finance recently, which certainly is a very good thing. But what we need to see now is much more of a focus on promoting an environmentally beneficial products through those trade finance elements. And I think that's something that we should see, particularly as part of the export strategy that should be being published next month, that it's no longer just enough to say, we want to be a leader in green trade and investment, as we saw at the investment summit yesterday with sort of speeches by the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for International Trade, but then not integrating that into the new export strategy, I think would be, you know, a real missed opportunity. And comes back to this idea that, you know, really when you're looking at green trade, there's not just one thing that any government or indeed company can do in order to make things better. It's lots of little things together having that future impact. Finally, just talking about greening supply chains. This is sort of coming from my experience working with clients. Greening supply chains is incredibly difficult and complex for a lot of companies. It's not just enough that we have sort of new legislation coming down the line, whether it's Deforestation Act here in the UK or some of the Sustainable Design Initiative directives coming through the EU, which places a lot more of an obligation on companies to understand what their supply chain is doing and where it's coming from and all of those products. But it is a case of going in and having to completely overhaul how companies procure different products through their suppliers. What sort of monitoring do you have in place? And then also, how do you audit your suppliers in order to ensure that they're actually living up to the standards that you've set through those new procurement guidelines? And I think this is just to say that, you know, you've got sort of the dual side of new regulation coming down the line, but also having to work with companies in order to actually make this happen. And how do we in the UK do that in a much more effective way going forward? And I think that's a discussion that needs to be had. So those are my three issues. I'll let Sam pick his now, but just thanks again to UKTPO for hosting us today.
Thank you, George. So I'm just going to get straight into it. So I've picked two potentially more politically contentious issues and one that's slightly more esoteric in the form of environmental services. But to start with, I thought I'd go with the discussion around conditionality in free trade agreements. And this is, of course, becoming quite a hot topic in the UK and the EU and elsewhere. And it is this idea that perhaps the preferential tariff arrangements afforded under a free trade agreement could be conditioned either on compliance with specific environmental or labour legislation, or on compliance with the different commitments in the TSD, Trade and Sustainable Development chapter, with the idea being, if in the event of non-compliance, that some of the benefits of the trade agreement could be withdrawn. And it's quite a fascinating discussion, because you can come at it from two different directions. One is that this is just disguised protectionism and is an attempt to shut down trade by adding a whole list of additional conditions and strings. But there is another view on this, which is actually conditionality can be trade liberalising if it allows countries to go further than they would have done otherwise. And I think an interesting example of that is actually the EU-UK TCA, where we have a duty and quota free agreement that would not have been possible unless the conditionality, and it's very strict conditionality, was included, and that's with reference to continued adherence with certain environmental rules, commitment, levels of protection, commitment not to roll back existing levels of protection, not to engage in deregulation for the purpose of competitiveness over the other. But then this brings me to the question of what is appropriate or achievable for the UK, which is a slightly different question, for example, than what would be appropriate or achievable for the US or the European Union. The UK is a slightly smaller economic entity, and therefore its leverage is perhaps lower. And here I think there probably is a need for realism, insofar as it is going to be difficult for the UK to include incredibly strict conditionality within its trade agreements, because its market offer perhaps isn't as large as is the case for some others. And also at the moment, it's difficult for the UK to even include very unstrict conditionality. For example, if the reports are to be true, just asking Australia in a non-binding way to commit to delivering to meeting its 1.5 degree temperature targets in the text, it struggles to do even that because of the desire for haste. The need to get trade agreements done quickly reduces some of its leverage. But this does not mean it's impossible. You could certainly see certain tariff rate quotas being linked to adherence to specific rules or certain levels of liberalisation, but the desire has got to be there. I think actually on this subject, just as a slight aside, the review of the unilateral preference schemes is probably the area where the UK could potentially do more. We've seen that the EU's review of its unilateral preference schemes, so these are the schemes that afford preferential access unilaterally to developing countries, and they're sort of packaged into different units. You have the LDCs, you have the lower income countries that aren't doing nice things, and then you have the lower income countries that are doing nice things, and the ones that are doing nice things get slightly better market access, subject to them complying with and signing up to a whole list of obligations. And in the EU's review, they've suggested adding the Paris Agreement to this GSP plus category in terms of the conditionality. The UK is also carrying out its own review at the moment. And of course, this is somewhere where it could consider adding, particularly in the environment space, a few additional obligations without unnecessarily burdening those countries, I would argue. The second issue I'm just going to touch on briefly is carbon border adjustment mechanisms. And this is something that's really come into the debate. Well, it's been around for ages, but no one ever thought anyone was going to actually do it. And then the EU tabled a proposal, and it looks like it's going to happen. And from a UK perspective, there are a number of different questions that need to be taken into account. The first, and I suppose the most importantly, is carbon leakage an issue for the UK? Has UK environmental legislation led to heavy industry offshoring? And the answer to that is, at the moment, there's not that much evidence to suggest that's occurred. Of course, there has been offshoring, but there's been lots of different drivers of that. And my view is it's largely been driven by arbitrage opportunities when it comes to the cost of labour. But that doesn't necessarily mean it won't be true in the future. If the UK does pursue its net zero agenda, does bring in the legislation necessary to achieve that, it is possible that offshoring could be a problem in the future. So therefore, the UK might want to consider a carbon adjustment, a border adjustment mechanism, so as to level the playing field for its own domestic consumers, producers, and more cynically, and I think there is a cynical element to carbon border adjustment mechanism discussions generally, more cynically create the political space necessary to get over the line all of the other legislation you want to get over the line, because you have to be able to answer the question of what about competitiveness, what about carbon leakage? And CBAM may be imperfect, but it does at least give you an answer. But the other dimension to the UK's consideration here has to take into account other countries implementing CBAMs and the potential UK consequences of them doing so. So, for example, if the EU introduces a carbon border adjustment mechanism, does that potentially mean that more high carbon products, such as, say, Turkish cement, that would have otherwise ended up on the EU market, suddenly ends up on the UK market, which will increase pressure from UK domestic producers of the same product for the UK to introduce equivalent levels of protection. So there is a trade deflection element to this. So in the same way we discuss this when we're discussing safeguards or trade defence mechanisms, I think this has to be taken into account in the carbon border adjustment mechanism debate. And then there is also a Northern Ireland dimension to this, which I'm not going to get into here, but I can either touch on in the questions or have written about elsewhere. To finish, I'm just going to shift lanes entirely and just discuss trade in environmental services, because this is something people like to talk about, but I think there's very rarely any meat on the bones. And I think there's a reason for that, in that it is very, very difficult to define what an environmental service is beyond some of the agreed definitions that we already have, which focuses on sewage, refuse disposal, sanitation, noise abatement, cleaning of exhaust gases, environmental protection services. But you then get to questions, okay, so certain George could be delivering an environmental service in his job at EY, but does that mean everyone working for EY delivers environmental services? No. So how do you differentiate between, well, maybe George would argue that they are, but how do you differentiate between these different types of provision? Because that's important, because if you can't decide what an environmental service is, you can't quantify it. And quantifying it in the first instance is quite useful, especially for somewhere like the UK, where you'd presume they'd have quite a good story to tell. But not only can't you quantify it, it becomes very difficult to single it out for liberalisation if you can't define what exactly you're talking about. And I know there's been a lot of very good work here. I think I saw that Ron Stieblick is on this call, and he's done some excellent work with ASEAN to try and sort of navigate a way through on the classifications. But it's certainly not easy. But then you get to the question of, okay, so how do you liberalise trade in environmental services? And if we were just to pick an example, so so an environmental service could be the installer who comes with the contract you've bought to introduce some solar panels to a whole range of buildings in the UK, and you've bought a contract from a foreign supplier, and it also has a person attached who comes and installs it, and then also a different person will come and maintain them over time. So how do you liberalise that? And the answer is the same as most services. If you want to liberalise trade in services, you look at the movement of people across borders, you look at the mutual recognition of professional qualifications, you look at data flows, you look at ease of establishment, you look at transparent licensing requirements, you look at your procurement process to make sure it's not discriminatory. These are all the same things as normal. So then the question for me is, well, is it useful to carve out environmental services in this debate? Or should we just be talking about liberalising services in general? Because if you liberalise them in general, you achieve the same outcome. And my view is that it probably is useful to carve out environmental services insofar as it might be possible to engage in increased liberalisation in that space, given the people's concerns about the environment and delivering on their different obligations. It might be easier to do that than were you to take a more general approach and say, well, we should just liberalise everything. But I do think it needs to be part of the discussion. I'll stop there. Obviously, we touched on lots of other things in the report, but we can touch on those in the questions if people are interested.
Well, George and Sam, thanks very much for very clear and concise presentation, and thanks also for keeping for time and also for selecting your topics. I was worried at the start you might want to go through the whole list, but I think you've chosen some really good topics for the discussion. So what I'd like to do now is move to our discussant. And Emily, I don't know if you'd like to switch your screen on at this point. Brilliant. So Emily is going to respond to the paper. Emily, again, I'm sure is very well known to this audience. She's reader in environmental law at the University of Sussex. She's a specialist in international trade law and has advised a number of UK parliamentary committees on the implications of Brexit. And by no means least, she's also Deputy Director of the UK Trade Policy Observatory. So Emily, over to you.
Thanks, Creon. So I thought I would just sort of offer a couple of thoughts on having a green trade strategy, because it seems to me that debates and sort of policy discussions on this are often bifurcated. So on the one hand, we have the trade economists, or what you might describe as sort of the pro-trade side of the aisle, focusing on how trade can aid green growth and the low carbon transition. And George mentioned the Board of Trade report in this kind of a context. And then we have what we might describe as the trade skeptics, really focusing on advanced forms of trade conditionality, as Sam spoke about. So, you know, what kinds of environmental or climate requirements can we impose in order for countries to access, you know, the great prize of UK preferential market access, shall we say. So obviously, both of these are really important pieces of the puzzle. But what I appreciate about this report and why I was very happy when George and Sam sent it to us, and why you should all read it if you haven't already, is that I think it provides a very useful and very sort of policy literate overview of the many areas in which trade policy bumps up against environmental issues. And actually, one thing that I took away was that one of the most imperative and also probably promising areas for green trade strategy is in the area of regulatory cooperation. So many, if not most of the recommendations are really about sort of cooperation and coordination between the UK and other countries, or between regulators. So just to list a few areas, we have environmental services regulation, getting international standard setting bodies to talk to each other, like the International Standards Organization and CEN and CENELAC. We have the need to align organic standards with UK trade partners, and particularly developing countries, classifying and eliminating fossil fuel subsidies through the ACTS agreement in the WTO. And I would also add cooperation on carbon pricing to that list to try to minimize sort of carbon tax related trade barriers and border carbon adjustment. So, and I do think, and maybe this is a sort of a contradiction in terms to some of you, but I do think it's an exciting time for regulatory cooperation on environmental issues internationally and plurilaterally, certainly in the WTO. And in some FTAs as well. There is an unprecedented amount of ambition in this area, which of course is good for trade ultimately, because proliferation of standards causes trade barriers. So where does this sort of leave the UK? I mean, I think as environmentalists, I know I'll claim the title, I'm not afraid. We sometimes have an instinct that that unilateral environmental regulation is the only way to achieve ambitious outcomes. And if we harmonize with other countries, or if we harmonize internationally, that will necessarily drive down standards. But I don't think that plays out in all cases for the UK. So just to look at one example of that, the ACTS agreement, the FTA between New Zealand and Indonesia and Norway and others, members have agreed to disciplines to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. And that first requires defining fossil fuel subsidies, which seems like sort of a technical issue, but is actually a great leap forward to have a definition upon which to base some sort of binding international cooperation, with potential for reverberations into WTO discussions on fossil fuel subsidy reform. And it defines a clear boundary in terms of what is and isn't acceptable. And the UK isn't quite ready for this yet. So, I mean, I think this is an example where plurilateral cooperation would actually move forward the UK's liberalization ambitions, but also potentially its climate change mitigation ambitions. Another thing that I think is useful about this report is that it really highlights how a lot of green strategy lies at the juncture of sort of the political and the technical. So a good example of this is, you know, we need a more inclusive and a more sort of updatable, if that's a word, approach to environmental goods liberalization. So that requires negotiation, but also, you know, updating the customs code so that you could actually figure out a way to implement tariff-free access for environmentally preferable products. And I think this report shows that there are some areas, you know, where the UK has taken leadership, both sort of politically and technically. I'm thinking about, for example, the FACT dialogue on agricultural commodity trade or environmental services discussions. And there are other areas in which the UK has not been that ambitious or simply sort of neglected to take a position. So here I'm thinking of an investor-state dispute settlement, fossil fuel subsidies in terms of not joining the acts and not joining WTO discussions on fossil fuel subsidies reform. Border carbon adjustment, I mean, obviously the UK has decided there are sensitivities due to the COP, but that's a highly technical and highly political issue where we know very little about the UK's thinking. So I think we can also use this report as the basis for a kind of a report card in terms of defining and bringing together issues for action or areas for action. And it does also feel to me that the thinking across government isn't fully integrated between the sort of the UK green ambitions and the UK trade ambitions. So, we have on the one hand, the Trade Department, DIT, their brief seems to be prioritizing liberalization. On the other hand, BEIS has just published the long-awaited net zero strategy yesterday. It has 368 pages, of which I've read all of them very carefully. One is on trade. One of those 368 is on trade, which in some sense, is you could say is fair enough, because our net zero target is primarily focused on domestic emissions reduction. But on the other hand, I think there's really an increasing recognition of the unavoidability of dealing with trade issues in environmental and climate strategies, and vice versa, that they're not actually separate issues and that they need to be integrated. And that's playing out, in the WTO. It's playing out in some FTAs. And it seems to me that it's definitely time for sort of global Britain to be a bit more explicit and transparent about issues at this intersection. So I found this report really useful, and I hope others will too.
Emily, thank you very much for those comments. And if I invite everybody to keep on the screen for the discussion we now have, we've already got a good set of questions, but I want to just jump in first before we move to those that our audience has posted. And it's really a question about the relationship between what's in your paper and the whole experience of the pandemic and COVID. So, across a whole range of areas, we're seeing questions about what the sort of post-COVID world is going to look like. There's a discussion around how the experience of COVID has actually influenced the way people are tackling climate change. Partly because it's an experience of a major catastrophic kind of shock. But I just wonder, is there anything in your paper, any of these multiple elements that you think is kind of different now because of the COVID experience than it would have been otherwise? Things that either in terms of the recommendations you're proposing or the issues you're identifying, or if not now, what in the future do you think is going to be different about how we handle climate change and trade because of the COVID experience? Maybe I could go to either George or Sam first, and then ask Emily.
Should I have
Sure.
a go at
Yeah.
answering? No, it is a phenomenal question, and I think one of the things that we didn't cover in the paper, but just purely, I think, for reasons of length and readability, is the whole discussion around what is the impact of climate change on trade itself. And I sort of a number of different components to that. One is, more extreme weather events will impact shipping lanes. You'll get sort of damage to critical port infrastructure as a result of rising sea levels, and also sort of where different commodities can be grown and produced will shift around the world. And I think the pandemic's really shown us the fragility, but also the strength in some ways of our global supply chains. And as climate change has more of an impact, both from a regulatory perspective that I was talking about with supply chains before, but also sort of those increased costs associated with moving products around the world, I think it's really shifted the emphasis around supply chain discussions towards resiliency, and how do we actually achieve resiliency while also being environmental and greening the supply chain. So I think a lot of the debate around how do you green supply chains, how do you move products around the world, decarbonizing our international trade, has shifted as a result of the pandemic and sort of all of the various, shipping costs and queues outside of the Port of LA, all the way through to sort of our own supermarkets here in the UK. So I think that's going to be quite a profound thing coming down the line.
Thanks, Sam.
There's not too much to add for that. I suppose an argument could be made that the disruption that we faced over the last year or so is a precursor of what's to come if certain actions by government aren't taken. And the difficulty with a lot of this is, whilst it is hypothetical, you assume that the disruption will happen. What's difficult is precisely identifying how that will be felt and how it will be materialised on the ground. But on the optimistic side, I suppose we've also, what the pandemic has identified is that governments can move fast and spend huge amounts of money if they need to. So in a way, the question of, well, can governments find the money to do all of the things we need? Yes, of course, the incentives just have to be there. And I suppose the difficulty with climate change is that the effects are slightly less acute in the short term than a virus that mutates and travels the world in a matter of months.
Thank you. Yes, Emily, any quick thought on this?
I mean, I think it's a mixed picture. I mean, I think, yes, it's delivered us a huge jolt, societal jolt, which you might say in particularly, as we were saying, in the area of ensuring resilient supply chain. So maybe that will bleed in to better coordination in the future. And it's also reduced emissions quite a lot, at least in a very temporary time frame. But I think one of the things that is been really difficult for the WTO international trade system is just monitoring and tracking and having transparency about subsidies. And post-COVID, the subsidies issue is sort of even more of a mess. I mean, we're all sort of state capitalists now. It seems difficult to figure out how the WTO system is going to sort of get on top of the subsidies issue at this juncture.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I would argue perhaps that the role of trade as a shock absorber is going to become more and more important because of extreme weather and, as George said, policy shocks and so on. So trade liberalization across the board, I mean, taking Sam's earlier point, soon we actually may not be able to distinguish between green stuff if the whole economy is becoming green. Trade liberalization across the board will become a bigger and bigger priority, potentially, if we want it to work as that shock absorber. But I mean, that's just one view. Okay, what I'd like to do is now try and take a number of our questions, and the panelists can also see these, but I'll read them out. And let's take the first question. X-outs are referenced as a method, though burdensome, for mitigating the dual use risks of liberalization of environmental goods. Do you think that better environmental benefit is achieved through having a higher tolerance to dual use risks and taking a broader approach to liberalization? Or should dual use be a more prominent factor in determining what should be liberalized? And I might just post another question as well so that we can sort of take these as a group. So the second question is, due to the complexities surrounding multilateral environmental goods negotiations, do you think governments should prioritize actions that can be taken unilaterally to support domestic environmental goods producers to market? If so, do you think the UKG approach to focus on multilateral reform is the right one? So let's take those two questions first, and George or Sam, if you'd like to choose between them.
I guess I'll go first again. So starting with the second question first, and there is obviously a need to prioritize. I think the UK has already the UK government has taken quite a few steps already through the UK global tariff to unilaterally support trade in environmental goods. I think there's then sort of two aspects. Okay, so what do you do that on sort of the trade negotiation front? And certainly we're seeing some movement at the WTO towards relaunching the EGA or a successor form of it. But what we're not seeing really at the moment is sort of prioritizing those EGA tariff lines as part of any bilateral negotiations and making sure that sort of they're incorporated not only at the multilateral level, but also through the bilateral free trade agreements as well. I think there's also a discussion to be had domestically around sort of what is an environmental good. I think in particular that will become more focused around bicycles and electric vehicles, claiming that bicycles, with all the political problems that are associated, claiming that bicycles aren't an environmental product, at least to me personally, doesn't feel to be a particularly credible position to have. On On the question of dual use, yeah, it's always been sort of this perennial problem in any discussion around environmental products, because a lot of the pipe, a good example of this is a lot of the pipes and scrubbers you need for renewable energy can also be used in oil and gas. So how do you make sure that those products that you're actually liberalising are environmental? And it comes back to that classification question. I think by and large, and sort of having done a lot of analysis through the EGA discussions, sort of for a lot of those product lines, the bulk of the products was tending now towards the environmental use. So I would probably lean towards, not in all cases, and I think you do need to take a case-by-case approach, but increasingly we're seeing the environmental uses for some of those dual-use products increasing and becoming the majority.
Yeah, Sam.
So to build on, and also to incorporate Ron Steenbeck's question, because it's similar on the dual use one that I accidentally answered in the chat by just saying sorry, which isn't the answer he's probably looking for, because he makes the point that when it comes to environmental services, aren't many of the same definitional problems the same as goods? And yes, it's the same sort of thing, right? I could be a geologist that one day is advising on offshore wind and the next day is advising on oil exploration. Right, theoretically. So you have a sort of one in one case I'm potentially delivering an environmental service and the next time not. And I'm with George on this, is that actually I would lean towards not worrying so much about dual use and going for broader liberalisation on the assumption that the economy, the direction of travel on a lot of this stuff is towards more environment stuff, right? So I think just freeing up people to be able to work across borders more easily is generally a good thing, and will ultimately, even if you do have some of these dual use cases, be preferential. But on the other question around unilateral measures, I think it's important to understand that acting unilaterally doesn't mean there are no negotiations to be had. Those negotiations just have to happen within government and between different sections. Because if we think about environmental goods agreement, environmental goods liberalisation in general, and this question of why a tariff has been retained on electric vehicles, on the one hand, you can argue that that is penalising trade in environmental goods. But the British government, if pushed, would probably also argue that it's an important component of its battery agenda and its desire to onshore the battery supply chain, which it would view as being part of its broader environmental agenda, in that this tariff is something that incentivizes the localization of certain bits of production. So you end up with this internal discussion around not only whether trade liberalization in this aspect is good or bad, but also what action greater contributes to the UK's push towards net zero, and it just becomes quite difficult. And you can look at it in other areas where the policy conflicts are maybe more stark. So if you think about UK discussions about joining the ACTS agreement, we've discussed that the concerns about fossil fuel subsidy controls have hindered some of the UK's ambitions in this element. But one of the other areas is that the UK just has identified a number of environmental goods tariffs it wants to keep, because it thinks it will be useful when negotiating with other countries in trade agreements in future. So this is a policy conflict and negotiation that entirely needs to happen within government. But there are competing priorities, and it's not always easy.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's also a question of how much do you actually try and do through the trade route, because there's a whole bunch of other climate action going on, and in a sense, one needs to look at the trade tool for climate action alongside all those other things. And certainly in other areas like carbon disclosure and so on, there's now a movement to say let's try and keep things as simple as possible to some extent in some of these areas, in order that when we mix them all together, we actually get a coherent sense. And if everything is too complicated, one can't do that. Emily, what I'd suggest is, because we got so many questions, is if you hold any thoughts until we take in a few more, this next question, and perhaps you'd like to come in on that. And that's essentially a question about should the UK government consistently embed the same environmental obligations in all its trade deals, so including FTAs and GSP, from this point on? And is there a way to reflect development levels in the articulation of that obligation? So that's right to the heart of the kind of question that's likely to come up in COP, I'm sure. So, Sam, would you like to go first?
Yeah, I'll go first. My view is that the UK should have a general idea of what it would like to be included, saying its trade and sustainable development chapters, but then they are subject to negotiation, and they should take into account differing levels of development. I mean, whenever I've written in form of a carbon border adjustment mechanism, for example, my view has been that least developed countries should be exports from least developed countries should be exempt from that measure, because it doesn't necessarily, otherwise it wouldn't necessarily align with broader climate commitments around differentiated responsibility. So I think it would be useful for the UK to have a general conception of what it would like, but it should acknowledge that that is subject to the specific conditions of any given negotiation. And of course, decisions have to be made, as in the trade agreement with Australia, is Australia's reported desire not to include specific temperature reduction goals a deal breaker or not? You know, they're still going to be referencing the Paris Agreement in that text. So whereas with New Zealand, it's probably going to be much easier to write in a whole load of TSD elements because both the UK and New Zealand want it there. So, yeah, I think, yes, good to have a general plan, but you have to accept that you can't impose your will on everyone, and nor should you.
Yeah. Emily, any quick thoughts on that? Because you've obviously written on this area to quite a degree.
Was that me?
Yes, sorry, Emily.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's a, as Sam said, it's a quid pro quo, and if you are have a massive consumer base to offer, then you have more leverage. So I think all of that is true, and we don't have as much leverage in that sense. But I think in a certain sense, there's a question of sort of conceptual coherence. So I think there is a hard question there that needs to be looked at square in the face, which is, you know, are we prioritizing liberalization, or are we prioritizing ensuring that our trade patterns are upholding our net zero targets? And I think, you know, there is a place for red lines here, and you know that is particularly true when we're thinking about shifting a lot of our trade to sort of Asia Pacific. So that seems to go against the logic, although there's obviously, you know, a debate to be had about localization as being a more climate emissions reduction friendly approach, and that's a nuanced issue. But my point is simply that you know, if we are going to be increasing our shipping emissions massively, we need to think about that square in the face and deal with the implications through assessing them well through sustainability impact assessment, which is another thing the report touched on, but also through considering having a stage at which we will walk away from the table.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what's your answer? Which should we prioritize? And, you know, isn't it better to make that decision sooner rather than later? I
mean, this is far above my pay grade, but
no, I don't think so.
No, I mean, I think that you know, there doesn't have to be a conflict, because as I said, you know, FTAs could actually put pressure on the UK to raise its ambitions, like the ACTS agreement. But I think those are the kind of FTAs we should probably be prioritizing. So I would take a harder line. Can I just step away from the table?
Can I just come in on this?
Sure, Sam, yeah.
So coming back to Australia again, just because actually there's going to be another agreement we're going to be all talking about from about this afternoon onwards. But sticking with Australia as being the one that's front of mind in the UK at the moment, could the UK have included more conditionality in that agreement? You know, because we're offering duty and quota-free access pretty much, with the exception of long grain milled rice. To the UK market. Could the UK have asked Australia to abide by certain environmental rules or levels of protection as a condition of access? My view is probably yes in the long run, because the offer was actually really, really good. But could the UK ask that of Australia if it wanted to do the negotiation quickly? Probably not. Because as soon as you add in an extra condition that constrains you, which is we want to get this done really quickly because we want to have something to show for our decisions we've made over the last few years, then Australia has more leverage and it doesn't really want to do these things. So if it doesn't feel it needs to, and it feels that the UK will eventually concede anyway, it won't. And I think that's where Emily's point about coherence is important, but also the understanding of competing priorities within the government itself.
Yeah. George, what I'd like to do is actually go to another question from Sophie Hale, and you could sort of link it to this to the extent that you want to. So, I mean, that's in the same space, but the question really is, do you see any issues with divergent investment and trade policies, e.g. with the lack of green trade policies? Will the lack of green trade policies deter green investment, which would benefit from better market access, protection from competitors with lower environmental standards? So this goes to like yesterday's summit and some of the issues you already flagged. So George, would you like to have a go at that, please?
I mean, thanks, Sophie. In essence, I do think it's a problem. This also points to one of the reasons as to why we wrote the paper in the first place, is to say there's a lot of available policy tools. There are some great initiatives going on, but it's not being done in a coherent way. And, you know, I think one of the things that sort of all of us working in international trade or, you know, international economics knows that an importer is also an exporter and an exporter is also an importer. And the idea that, you know, you can just do one or the other doesn't really apply in our modern economy. So there does have to be, you know, a much greater link between what's happening on the investment front and what we're doing on the trade policy side of things.
Could I link that to ISDS more broadly, which is obviously an issue you've covered? Could you just say, I mean, there's a question, could greater use of conditionality in trade agreements where ISDS applies help mitigate investor challenge? But also more broadly, if you want to just give your, I mean, because there is a big controversy over ISDS and how it relates to climate change. If you could say a little bit about you cover it in your topical issues.
So I'll start, but then quickly pass on to Sam because he's done a lot more work on ISDS. I think certainly the UK government hasn't made a decision around what it wants to do with ISDS, and I think that's part of why we're having this conversation. You know, through a lot of the continuity FTAs and old bilateral investment treaties, obviously it's still there. With the new generation, say with Japan, the issue's been effectively kicked down the road. And it probably won't be in Australia because Australia is one of their red lines. So I think we're in a very uncertain environment with regards to sort of that historical ISDS versus going forward. That said, sort of if we were to take sort of or agree a new ISDS provision or treaty, then there's a lot that's being done, in particular on global health, where you just have carve-outs now. And I think that for across several sectors that could be replicated. But I don't know, Sam, do you want to?
The ISDS in the UK discussion is tricky because the UK already has a large number of investment treaties that include the provision and they're not going anywhere, right? So we have a legacy ISDS and then you have questions around renegotiation of certain provisions. So if you think about the Energy Charter Treaty, which is a European largely treaty that includes investor-state dispute settlement. Lots of cases have been brought under it. I should say that actually the story on ISDS in relation to environmental provisions is actually more mixed than people sometimes let on, in that the stories you always hear about is when ISDS has been used to challenge a decision to do something that's ostensibly environmentally good. But it also has been used to challenge decisions that are ostensibly environmentally bad, such as Spain phasing out subsidies for solar panels. Right, so there's a bit of a mix there, but the negotiations there, the trajectory seems to be, if you're looking at the EU proposal, a desire to carve out fossil fuel subsidies from its coverage so that it wouldn't apply in those instances anymore. And I know this is something that the UK government is thinking about because ISDS is a strange one in that it is a potentially large contingent liability on future regulatory action. And in the context of net zero, where the government might be legislating in future to indirectly appropriate assets, or at least change the regulatory environment to a point that certain investments are no longer viable, it is possible that the UK could be challenged under existing treaties. So it's something the government's aware about, but then I have a slightly cynical view on ISDS as well, which is actually there's very few studies that can determine whether there's any benefit or not in terms of investment. It's all quite inconclusive. But my view is that probably ISDS does benefit the UK because we host a large number of the legal industry that benefit from it, and I'm sure they do quite well out of it. So but that's not a view government ever takes. But yeah, so it's something government is thinking about and considering, but there just isn't an easy answer because we've got all of these legacy agreements that we haven't had to confront it in the new negotiations just yet, but we will, particularly when the CPTPP discussions come up. So, and then I defer to George. I think if you are worried about it, at least where you can, you can carve out certain areas of policy, and that's probably what it will try and do.
I mean, there is a way of dealing with legacy agreements, which doesn't involve renegotiating them, but it does involve countries having a kind of common view as how they should be interpreted. So
exactly,
there is a proposal on that, which actually a Chatham House paper deals with. But Emily, any views on this question or other things that you would have liked to comment on up to this point, but haven't had the chance? Unfortunately, we're almost out of time.
Yeah, I think we're running over, but just to say, I encountered an article from a bunch of Australian civil society actors who were very concerned about having ISDS with the UK and how that would open up their government to all kinds of anti-environmental action. So these things cut both ways.
Right. Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. My clock says 10:30, but then it's one of those laptops that are probably not not keeping proper time. But let me conclude by thanking our panelists and our discussant for a tremendous presentation discussion, and thanks Ingo to you for convening us all. Apologies I didn't get to your questions, but hopefully they'll be answered in some way. But maybe I'll just pass back to Ingo and then we can conclude.
Well, thank you very much. So we mustn't overrun by more, but the long list of questions that are in the chat, and we didn't get to answer all of them, just as testimony to the fact that webinar really hit a nerve. It is a very, very crucial discussion to be had. So thanks a lot to all four of you, the three speakers and Creon, and we continue working in that space. Thank you very much. Stay safe and have a good day.
Okay. Cheers.